Hello everyone, welcome to Unit 1, Day 10. We're going to talk about measures of position today. So really we're gonna learn how to find measures of position. That's really our only goal for today, and learn what the common measures of position are. All right, so as I said, the common measures of position are what we call the quartiles and the percentiles. All right, and the way we think about this, you've probably heard of percentiles before. Maybe you've had a younger sibling that was a baby, and when you're born as a baby, they take your weight and your height measurements, and they say, okay, you weigh 10 pounds, and that puts you in the 90th percentile for birth weight. And there's a certain meaning to that. Okay, so when they say that you're in the 90th percentile for something, or if you take a test and you score in the 99th percentile, what exactly does that mean? All right, so when we talk about a percentile is a way of dividing the data. So if you think about all of the data or all of the test scores, the 99th percentile would place 99% of the test scores in the bottom and 1% in the top. So it divides the top 1% from the bottom 99% of the test scores. All right, so that's essentially what a percentile does. We're going to see that in action today, what that looks like when we have a list of data. Now we also have these things called quartiles, which are special percentiles, and they represent the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 75th percentile. All right, so quartile 1 represents the 25th percentile, quartile 3 represents the 75th percentile, and then quartile 2 is the 50th percentile, and we also call that the median. Okay, so special names for a lot of different things. All right, and again, so these two paragraphs here just kind of give us they give us an example of what the percentiles do to data, and I think of it as a way of kind of dividing the data into two groups dependent on your position. All right, so let's take a look at some examples. It's easier to see once you've done it what the percentiles and quartiles look like. All right, so what we have here, these are some test scores from two of my calculus classes that I had in the past, and we're going to find something called the 5-number summary. Okay, and we'll talk about what that is in just a second. We're going to determine if there are any outliers. So we've seen this word pop up before when we were doing the scatter plots, and we're going to make modified box and whisker plots for each of these, but we're going to do that tomorrow. All right, so for right now, we're just going to focus on finding the 5-number summary and any outliers that might exist in these data sets. All right, so here's my test scores from the first class. We'll call it Class A, and we have the individual test scores, and we can see those here. And then we have our test scores for the second class, which we'll call Class B. All right, so there's 20, I'm just going to put this number over here. There are 20 test scores in the first class, and there are 21 test scores in the second class. All right, so 20 students here, 21 students here, and we want to find this thing called the 5-number summary. All right, so here we go. So we've got this 5-number summary. It's all down here, and you'll see I've got it listed horizontally here. So we have the minimum, quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, and the maximum. All right, so these are the 5 numbers that we are trying to find. This is what we mean by a 5-number summary. So the minimum being the smallest number in the data set, the maximum being the largest number in the data set, and then our 3 quartiles, which I already explained above, and we'll see how we find those. All right, so to find the 5-number summary, what we want to do is we want to take our test scores from Class A. So we're going to do Class A first here, and we are going to order them. That means we're going to order them from the smallest test score all the way up to the biggest test score. So we want them in order. And you'll notice when I first gave them to you here, they were not in order. All right, so one of the tedious parts of doing this by hand is actually just putting the data in order, especially if you have very large data sets. That can be a time-consuming process. I'm going to show you how to do that using technology on our calculator here in just a minute. So be ready for that. All right, but the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to find the median or quartile 2. All right, and remember what a quartile does, or what a percentile does, is it divides our data at 50%. So in other words, we're trying to find a number that will put 50% of the data in the bottom and 50% in the top. All right, so we're trying to split this data in half essentially. So you'll notice there's 20 pieces of data here. So if I want to split it in half, I'm going to want 10 pieces of data in the lower half. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I'm going to want 10 pieces in the upper half, right? So if I split my data right here, right, I would have 10 pieces of data over here on the left and 10 pieces of data over here on the right. So this number that exists in between 80 and 81, this is quartile 2, or what we would call the median. All right, now we don't see the number that's in between the two, but we can certainly calculate it, right? So I can take 80 and 81 and find the average. All right, so I can take 80 plus 81, divide by 2, and you would get 80.5, and this would be quartile 2, or the median. Or you can call it the 50th percentile. Okay. So in other words, if you scored an 80.5, that would place you in the 50th percentile. That means 50% of the test scores were lower than your test score, but 50% of the test scores were also higher than your test score. All right, so that's how we interpret that percentile. Now we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to find the first quartile. And the way that we find the first quartile is we take this lower half of the data, right? So here's my lower half of the data, and we're going to chop the lower half in half, right? So there's 10 pieces of data here in this lower half, and so I'm going to chop that in half. That means I would want 5 pieces of data, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this is where I would split it in half, right? So the first quartile is going to exist in between 69 and 76. So I got to find the average between those two pieces of data. So I'm going to take 69 plus 76 and divide it by 2. This will find that midpoint between the two numbers. And if I do that calculation correctly, I should get a 72.5. And we would call this quartile 1, or the 25th percentile. Okay. So then if you scored a 72.5 on the test, that means you did better than 25% of the test takers out there. Okay. It's not too bad. All right, and then we're going to find the third quartile, right? So here's my upper half of the data. So I want to take the upper half of the data and I want to cut that in half, right? So I'm going to take this half of the data. And remember, there are 10 pieces of data in there, so I'm going to cut 10 pieces of data in half. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to get cut in half here in between 90 and 91. Right? So this is where the third quartile exists. And you start to see why they call these measures of position. It's what position are you in the data, right? What's your ranking in the data? All right, so we're going to take 90 and 91. We're going to find that number in between. Probably do this in your head, right? But if I find the midpoint between 90 and 91, it should be 90.5, and that would be quartile 3, or the 75th percentile. All right, so there we go. And we have our 3 quartiles, and finding our min and our max is really easy once you have the data ordered. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and write down my 5-number summary. The minimum test score, the smallest test score in the set was a 30. Right? And then quartile 1, we found that right here. We found that to be 72.5. Quartile 2, median or 25th percentile, was 80.5. And our third quartile or 75th percentile was 90.5. And then our maximum test score, the highest test score in the class, was a 99. All right, so there's my 5-number summary. That's how you find it by hand. All right, now things do change a little bit when you go from having an even number of pieces of data to an odd number of pieces of data. So notice, remember in our first class we had 20. Well, in our second class we have 21. So it's going to look a little bit different when we find these same pieces of data for class B. So let's take a look at that real quick. All right, so here's class B, same thing, same first step here. We're going to order the data, right? So I have it ordered from least to greatest. And again, I'm going to show you how to do that quickly on your calculator, so don't worry about doing that by hand, all right? And we're going to start by finding quartile 2, right? So I'm going to take the data, I'm going to chop it in half, and then I'm going to chop it in half. I'm going to chop the halves in halves again to find quartile 1 and quartile 3, okay? So remember, there's 21 pieces of data here, all right? Which means the middle number is actually going to be 80. It's going to be one of the pieces of data, right? So this is quartile 2, and here's why. Right? If I count up the number of pieces of data to the left, there are 10 pieces of data there. And if I count up the number of pieces of data to the right, there are 10 pieces of data here. And this one left over in the middle divides those two, right? So this becomes our median. This is the physical middle of the data, all right? So when there's an odd number of data pieces, an actual data piece will be the median. You will not have to calculate it. But if it's an even number, the median is going to exist in between two of the data values. All right, so that can be a little confusing for students sometimes, but these 10 pieces of data become our lower half, and these 10 pieces become our upper half, and we found quartile 2 without having to do a calculation. So quartile 2 is 80. All right, now I'm going to find quartile 1, so I got to take these 10 pieces of data here, and I need to chop that in half. Now, since it's even, it's going to exist in between two of the data values here. So we're going to have 5 and 5. So that's going to be in between 72 and 73 here. All right, so I have 5 here, 5 here. So this is quartile 1, and I have to calculate it. All right, so we're going to say 72 plus 73 divided by 2, which is 72.5. So that becomes quartile 1. Right, and then we're going to do the same thing to find quartile 3. So I'm going to count 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to split it in half there. So there's 5 pieces of data and 5 pieces of data. So this is where quartile 3 exists. And we would do that same calculation, although it's unnecessary because it's the same number, 95 plus 95. If you add that together and divide by 2, you're going to get 95. All right, so I'm just going to say quartile 3 is 95. All right, and then again, the min and the max, really easy to find once you have them ordered. All right, so we're going to have a minimum test score of 33 and a maximum test score of 100. And we get our 5-number summary. Now let me show you how to do this on your calculator. Trust me, you're going to want to watch this part of the video. It is going to save you a lot of time because I do not expect you to find the 5-number summary by hand. In fact, I encourage you to use the calculator and the TI-84, and this is why this calculator is going to be so vital. If you haven't picked one up yet, go to the store and get one, or come to the school and I will rent one out to you. All right. So to find our 5-number summary using the calculator, first thing I want you to do is hit the stat button here. You'll see it says stat, S-T-A-T, should be right next to the left key. Hit that. Okay. Then you're going to go to edit. All right. So just hit number 1. And you're going to go over to list 1 here, and you'll notice, right, it says L1 at the top, standing for list 1. And what I have done here is I took the 20 test scores, that first set of data from class A, and I put it into list 1. So you literally just type 69, hit the down arrow, and it takes you to entry number 2, and you just keep on going through and entering in all of your data. Okay, and if you scroll through here, you'll see it's the same data from class A. Okay. It's in the same order here. And then over here in list 2, I put the data for class B. Right? So I can put in all the data at once, so you can have as many lists as you want here, and you'll get a listing of that data in each one. Now, I told you there was a quick way to sort it, so let me show you how to do that. Once you've got the data entered into the calculator, you can quit out. The calculator automatically saves it. So if you go back, you'll notice that it's still there even if you exit out of that screen. Okay. So I want to order my data. So what I want you to do is I want you to hit stat, and you see this option here where it says sort A. That stands for sort ascending. So I'm going to click option 2, and there will be a parentheses there, and you're going to tell it what to sort. You see here in blue where it says list, I'm going to hit second stat, and I'm going to tell it to sort list 1. I'm going to hit enter and close off that parenthesis. And you see here it says sort A list 1, and I'll hit enter, and all it'll say here is done. But when I go back to my list, if I go stat, edit, you'll notice here in list 1, everything has been sorted from least to greatest for you. Okay. So it takes a few key pushes, a couple of seconds to sort the data using your calculator. Okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing for list 2 real quick. So one more time here, watch me closely. I'm going to hit stat, go down to option 2, sort A, and then I'm going to hit second stat, and this time I'm sorting list 2, close parentheses, now it says done. And when I go back to my list, now list 2 is also sorted from least to greatest. Okay. Now, let's find our 5-number summary. using the calculator. You guys are going to like this, all right? So I'm going to hit Stat. You'll notice up here where it says Calc, I'm going to go to the right, and this first option here says 1 var stats. This is probably the coolest button on the calculator right here. So I'm going to hit Enter, and it's going to ask you which list do you want to run 1 var stats on. I'm going to tell it that I want list 1, and I'm going to go to Calculate. Just let it do its thing, and you'll be in this menu now. If you hit the down arrow, you'll be able to scroll down, and you'll notice down here at the bottom that you have your 5-number summary. There's your min, quartile 1, the median, quartile 3, and your maximum. Right? So if in this, we'll get you this. It uses the same exact process that I showed you over here in the notes. So you should get the same exact numbers. Right? So it's really quick to calculate this stuff using the calculator. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but I want to get the 5-number summary for what I have in list 2. All right, so this time I'm going to hit Stat, Calculate, 1 var stats, and this time I'm going to tell it list 2. So I'm going to clear out list 1, hit second Stat, go down to L2, make sure it says L2 right here, and then calculate. There we go. So now I have my 5-number summary for list 2. This is for class B. And you should see we got the same thing. Let's just double check, make sure we did, right? So 33, 72.5, 80, 95, and 100. All right, so there is that. Now, next thing we need to talk about here is how to find the outliers. I promised you I'd tell you how to find the outliers. Now, we saw outliers when we talked about the scatter plots in our Desmos activity, which was really cool. You guys immediately identified them and said, hey, there's this data that's over here, and then we have this one data point that seems to be kind of far away from the rest of the data. Well, the question is, how far away from the rest of the data do you have to be before you're considered to be an outlier, right? How far away does that piece of data have to be? And there's an actual calculation for it, and it's a mostly defined calculation that is accepted through most stats textbooks, and most statisticians accept this calculation here to calculate whether or not something is in fact an outlier. All right, so to start off determining whether or not a piece of data is an outlier, we need to calculate this thing called an interquartile range. All right, and it's very simple to calculate. We just take quartile 3 minus quartile 1. Okay, so from class A, right, quartile 3 was 90.5, right? So we just take 90.5 and we would subtract quartile 1, which was 72.5. Just subtract those two numbers, you get 18. Okay, so that is the IQR, or interquartile range, for class A. Then we do the same thing for class B. All right, so class B had a third quartile of 95. And then it had a first quartile of 72.5, so I'm going to subtract those two numbers, and we get 22.5 for the IQR for class B. All right, now the next thing we're going to calculate is what's called an upper fence. All right, and we'll talk about why it's called a fence here in just a minute, but let's just calculate it real quick. All right, so the calculation for this is quartile 3 plus 1.5 times the IQR. All right, so we're going to take 90.5 plus 1.5 times 18. We're going to get a number, right? And that number is 117.5. We'll come back to that number in just a minute. All right, next thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate the lower fence, right? So here's our calculation for the lower fence. So our first quartile is 72.5. And we're going to subtract 1.5 times 18. And the number that we get for that one is 45.5. Okay, so the upper fence, like I said, they call it a fence because it acts just like a fence, right? So you're either on one side of the fence or the other. For the upper fence, if you're on the upper side of the fence, in other words, if you are bigger than 117.5, you're an outlier. Okay, so we did not have any test scores that were bigger than 117.5, so there's no outliers on that side. All right, now we come over here to the lower fence. So similarly, if we're too low, we could also be an outlier, right? So if we're on the lower side of this fence, we would be considered an outlier. So if my test score was lower than 45.5, that would make me an outlier. And we did have one test score that was lower than 45.5, which was the score of 30. So 30 is considered an outlier by the definition of this lower fence. All right, so let's see if we had any outliers in class B. All right, so we do the same calculation here, just with the data from Class B. All right, so the upper fence here would be 95. That's our third quartile, plus 1.5 times 22.5. So remember, our IQR for Class B was 22.5, so I'm using a different number there, and we get a number of 128.75. So we certainly didn't have any test scores that were bigger than that, so we're not going to have any outliers in that direction, but we might have one in this one. So we're going to take our IQR, or I'm sorry, our first quartile, which is 72.5, and we're going to subtract from it 1.5 times 22.5, and we get a lower fence of 38.75. All right, so anything smaller than this would be an outlier, and we did have one test score that was smaller than this, so it was 33. Okay, so these would be outliers, and we tend to look at outliers and wonder, okay, well, what happened? Why, if we did get a piece of data that was so far away from the rest of the data, right? Like these test scores were much lower than the rest of the class, right? What caused this student to get a 30 when the rest of the class was doing great? Was there some factor, some external thing that happened to the student, or that caused them to get this low test score? So as a teacher, it would be my duty to kind of investigate what happened with that score of 30. All right. Same thing with this one here, a 33 being an outlier. It's extremely low. We'd want to talk to that student and find out what's going on. All right. So that is how you find outliers. That's how you find your 5-number summary. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know in the Zoom chat. Have a great day, guys.